Welcome to Energy Thinks, a podcast about the oil and gas industry's role in the energy future. I'm Tisha Schuller, your host and the CEO of Adamantine. We are at a pivotal time, a time I'm calling the moment. Forces are conspiring to lay bare the myth of a simple and quick energy transition. I've been talking to leaders in and around the oil and gas industry about what this means for you, the oil and gas leader. I have a really fun show for you today. I had on Ruy Teixeira. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I was introduced to him by reading a favorite guest and friend, Roger Pilkey, who will be on the podcast soon, and a survey that they did that you'll hear about on the show. He has just some really interesting perspectives that I know you're going to love, and you can read more about him in our show notes. Please go to energythinks.com or Substack and subscribe to my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. And I think that you're going to be interested in some of the conversation. We had conversations about climate and energy. Now, here's my conversation with Ruy Teixeira.
Ruy Teixeira, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Things podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. Interesting times we live in, I must say.
These are really interesting times, and you have both a newsletter and a podcast called the Liberal Patriot. So I'd love for our listeners who aren't acquainted with your work to start a little bit with an intro to you. Are you liberal? Are you conservative? Are you patriotic? Like, who are you? What are you? What are you trying to accomplish with your work?
Well, I was at the Center for American Progress before I came to the American Enterprise Institute in 2022. And I was at the Center for American Progress from its inception in 2003 to 2022. So, I was part of kind of the liberal institutional world, as it were. I've always been, consider myself a Democrat, oriented in that direction. But I became increasingly dissatisfied with the direction the Democratic Party was going in. So I felt that I needed to start making arguments that were different than people were making. And the more I did that, the less welcome I felt in the Democratic world. And I wound up going to AEI, which is a much more oddly pluralistic atmosphere than you typically see in the left institutional world, where there's an enormous amount of groupthink on a variety of issues, including energy, that I just couldn't put up with anymore. So my view is we're in kind of a weird interregnum period between, there's no party that's really clearly dominant. I think both parties have severe problems. And I think neither one of them appear to be on the verge of solving them. So, and I put out a big report with my colleague at AEI, Yuval Levin, called Politics Without Winners. And I think we're still in that space where neither party really has what it takes, or maybe even interested in finding out what it takes to really dominate American politics for an extensive period of time.
So you and I share a couple of things in common. I've always identified as a Democrat and even environmentalist. And over the course of the last 20 years, I had worked increasingly for the oil and gas industry, and also found myself somewhat homeless. And but I will say that I increasingly think it's important for us to speak out within our group. And in fact, I had Matt Iglesias on this podcast, and we talked a lot about that, the power and importance of sort of in-group critiques, which I've learned a lot from your colleague, Jonah Goldberg, who writes about that in particular. And so I give you a lot of credit. It is a lonely place to be critiquing your tribe. So let's explore a little bit about some of that work.
Okay.
You've published with my friend and colleague and previous guest, Roger Pilkey, who has joined you over there at the American Enterprise Institute. So great job to them. So you guys put out a report that brought you, front and center to my attention about climate and its role in both public opinion and therefore politics and policy. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from that study and how it's affected how you're thinking about the role of climate in these political times?
Actually, let me ask you about that, your question. Are you referring to, because Roger and I haven't put out a report yet. It's still in the editing and production process. We've written about a survey that we did
That's what I'm referring to. The Substack
right.
that you and he have commented on. But
Right.
that's good to know. I'm not behind. I haven't missed the report yet.
No, you haven't missed the report. The report will be something like the conception is the voters versus the science versus the narrative. So there's kind of a narrative about things. There's the scientific and physical underpinnings of that narrative or the contradictions with it. And then there's what actual voters think. And that's what we wrote about. And it's very clear if you look at the data, and it's not just our survey, it's lots of other public opinion data as well, that climate change is very much a tertiary issue for most voters, particularly working class voters, that they're not, in fact, devoted to an all-in rapid transition to renewables. They're basically oriented toward all of the above, even though they're quite positive about, for example, solar energy. They're not really that interested in changing their consumer behavior rapidly to encompass electric vehicles and a variety of other appliances that are supposed to be sort of climate friendly. They care most in terms of energy about cost and reliability. They're much, much, much less concerned about climate change. And even in terms of what changes they've seen in climate or weather in their area, most of them basically people don't really see it happening, this catastrophe, so-called, except people do tend to report having seen more heat waves. But the rest of it is pretty dicey. So kind of the takeaway is that the level of concern among the broad public, particularly working class voters, is dramatically less than you see in the climate advocacy community and certainly in most sectors of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party I wrote a whole long report about this for AEI that was based on some work I did for the Liberal Patriot called, From Environmentalism to Climate Catastrophism, a Democratic Story, where I tried to trace the evolution of democratic environmentalism from, even all the way back to just the conservation movement, and all the way through, on Vote and the sort of his initial catastrophist perspective, and then really Silent Spring and Rachel Carson is the kickoff of the modern environmental movement. But that really plugged in, even though there was an apocalyptic tone to Carson's work, the initial instantiation of that as politics was fundamentally reformist. Clean the air, clean the water. We can do this, and that's the important thing. We're just going to make the environment a lot better than it used to be. And then that mutated eventually into sort of the anti-nuclear movement, which definitely had an apocalyptic stance. And then the climate change movement takes off in the late 80s and early 90s, Bill McKibben stuff. You get Al Gore in 2006 with an inconvenient truth about how 30-foot tidal waves are going to engulf the world. And we're on the precipice of destruction. And that view becomes increasingly the dominant view. Without going into too much detail about it, if you look at the last 10 to 15 years of climate and energy policy on the left, that view has definitely completely dominated the discourse. It's extremely common for your garden variety liberal to have a totally apocalyptic view toward what is happening with the climate and the necessity to get rid of fossil fuels as fast as possible. Indeed, the view that your friends in the oil and gas industry are basically evil, right? They're like,
and
they're the apostle, they're tools of Satan, So
they can both have climate be a lower priority and have an apocalyptic view, which is what's interesting, right? These are lightly held but very extreme positions because they're sort of they're without cost. You can be an apocalyptic climate believer and not actually have to make sacrifices, right? So it's been free until recently.
Well, yes and no about that. I would say, in defense of our liberal environmentalist friends, that they are liberal college educated voters, for example, who are Democrats. They will put the climate change issue much farther up in the list of priorities than the average or median voter. It'll still be below things like the economy and other things, but in their defense, they do at least ascribe it a higher priority than sort of the average voter for whom, again, it really is a tertiary issue. But it's like a moral quest, right? I mean, it is
Right.
quasi-religious. It is part of the faith. So you don't question faith, you just practice it. And I
Yeah.
think that's what the climate religion and sort of commitments have become for a lot of people on the left.
Well, you're setting up the idea of the premise of the book I'm working on, which is essentially that there has been a myth, and I mean myth in terms of like the power of a myth of an easy energy transition, and that
Hmm.
if you are in fact a good liberal, and I subscribe to this belief myself for many years, that the energy transition would be relatively easy if entrenched, if the villain, the
Right.
entrenched interest,
Uh,
didn't keep it from happening. Now, what's interesting is, so that's led to this idea of what I'm calling the moment, which is, if as the myth is unraveling, there is an opportunity. There's an opportunity to both address climate action
hmm.
and have more and address what I call the three T's, like truth, time frame, and trade-offs. Like, this is going to be hard, it's going to be expensive, we're not going to be able to do everything, we're going to have to be a little more realistic. There's
Hmm.
a sort of interesting thing happening right now, though, which is under the second Trump administration, climate has kind of become one of these forbidden topics, like DEI or other things
Hmm.
we used to be able to say, let's find a middle path. And so now I'm struggling a little bit with, like, how do we narrate these priorities of voters? Do you think if this kind of reaction, like Trump, like climate is off the table, do you think that that is the right response to the it being a low priority of working class voters, or will it become a higher priority if it's completely unattended to by, for example, the federal government? Do you have any first thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't know. I would not be too sanguine about climate becoming a much higher priority than it currently is today. I don't think that's likely to happen anytime soon. Um, I do think that it's not just that its continual status as a tertiary issue has to some extent doomed the movement. It's also, I think, a lot of what you were alluding to, which is that the actual constraints on an energy transition are so severe, uh, and all these unintended things, unanticipated things, at least for most people who believe in this stuff, have come to the fore in terms of reliability and cost and political problems. Um, and it's starting to slowly penetrate into the brains of some people who are concerned about this, that is just a matter of fundamental physical and economic reality. There's real severe constraints on how fast this transition can go and how much you can actually rely on wind and solar as opposed to other potential sources of clean energy. How soon are you going to be able to get rid of natural gas and other fossil fuels? Not very soon, as Vaclav Smil puts it. People toss out these dates, because they're aspirational. They're not aspirational, they're delusional. I mean, we will not get to net zero in this world by 2050 unless we crash the world economy and everybody sort of takes a huge hit in their standard of living. It's not going to happen. So,
Mm-hmm.
is it still a reasonable goal to try to change the energy mix over time? Absolutely. But the over time part of it is key. And I think the typical Democratic, climate oriented voter who considers themselves well informed, they have not been smil pilled. I mean, they haven't really confronted the realities of what they're advocating. And I think
Yeah,
that's starting to penetrate, though. I think that, as we can see from how the politics of this are playing out in Europe, we can see it in terms of the reactions of the energy industry. I mean, there's definitely people are coming to see that we're now in a different era to some
mm-hmm,
extent, right? I mean, Roger
mm-hmm.
Pilkey put this the other day. He said, I think we're actually moving into a phase where the great climate alarm is starting to decay. It's not over. People will still think about climate, and they should, but the kind of the frenzy about it is starting to die away. I mean, the attention cycle is sort of over on the other side. I mean, where
It's
people
interesting because
that people
being a yeah, and Roger's going to be on the podcast soon too, to pick up that thread that you just mentioned. There's something interesting about this, which is, as the sort of the myth unravels, and climate remains as you say, tertiary priority of voters. And yet, there is, of course, a huge swath of people that will say, okay, we're done with climate. I, being a weird optimist and
Hmm.
still liberal at heart, can see a path where climate becomes less polarized, and therefore, like, we could actually make more progress. For example, I've always argued we could make more progress on decarbonizing with the oil and gas industry as a
Sure.
central player rather than forbidding their participation. Even just the incremental change you could see from powering all this data center build out from natural gas versus coal, for example, something like that is just going to be really
Absolutely. Yeah.
important to have the industry at the center. So I listened with interest in preparation for this podcast to two interviews you did recently. You
Hmm.
interviewed Derek Thompson on his book with Ezra Klein, Abundance,
Hmm.
and Mark Dunkelman on Why Nothing Works. And because I wanted to test this idea that there could be that perhaps we could be opening up a window where we could be talking about the energy transition, particularly Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson put climate at the center of their thinking. And yet, interestingly, that orthodoxy that clean energy still means wind and solar, that clean energy still means not having corporate interests, like at the table pursuing their business interests, like those orthodoxies we're still pervading this journey. I'm curious if you also picked up on that, and if you think there
Hmm.
is a window for like a center left, center right, energy transition, climate action, where abundance could include, for example, oil and gas companies being a part of decarbonizing. What are your first thoughts about that?
Yeah. Uh, yeah, I think it is possible, but let me talk about what I see as some of the obstacles to it, and it gets back to your question about now we're kind of gone from like being obsessed with it under Biden to like now we can't talk about it under Trump, um, which obviously makes things somewhat difficult. But we need to ask the question, well, why is that? And I think one reason for it is, I mean, yes, Trump is Trump. The GOP has many problems, but if it hadn't been the case that for so many years the discourse was so dominated by the kind of climate catastrophism and energy unrealism that we've been talking about, it wouldn't have been the case necessarily that the transition when the GOP got back into power, they take such an unremittingly hostile attitude toward the climate issue, and even though there's some weird stuff going on with scrubbing stuff from sites and stuff like that. I mean, Chris Wright, as Secretary of Energy, is actually a pretty reasonable guy as far as I can see. I mean, I think he's got a good handle on the overall problem, sort of both in terms of climate, in terms of energy realism and the mix going forward, and the global need to sort of get rid of energy poverty as being first and foremost the issue, and so on. I agree with a lot of that. But a lot of this is just kind of the thermostatic reaction to the way Democrats talked about it for so long and how unbelievably hegemonic that discourse was, how they completely controlled that view, the way it was covered in mainstream media and in lots of other places, and where it was sort of climate denialism got, sort of defined up from saying there was no global warming to like, if you weren't with the total program, you were a climate denier. If you just thought it wasn't a catastrophe, you're a climate denier. If you thought that we shouldn't rely on wind and solar, you're a climate denier. If you thought fossil fuels have a role to play in the future, you're a climate denier. I mean, none of that made any sense, and certainly isn't a way to bring people together around important policy issues. But so the Trump and the GOP are reacting to that, and it's unfortunate because I think if you look where the average voter is at, I think they would be happy with the middle ground. I mean, they're concerned with their lives, with energy abundance, sort of how much their energy costs. But if they can get that at the same time as they do something about climate, they're happy to see it. But they're just not dogmatic. They just don't
Mm-hmm.
hate. They just don't hate the fossil fuel industry the way like the Sunrise Movement does, right? They don't.
Yeah,
They
and
just have to.
there's some important lessons in there as well, which is for energy companies, even if they believe that this may go on forever, not to repeat that kind of absolutism that engenders the total opposite reaction. You could foresee a situation where in 3.5 years we have another climate administration that is very anti-oil and gas industry, and I think that it is up to
Right.
the industry to prevent that from happening by not taking on this sort of absolutism. At least that's my hope. So in that same spirit,
Oh, but
you go ahead.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to then touch on the issue raised about the abundance movement in my
Yeah.
talks
Oh yeah, please.
with Derek and with Mark, because I do think it's an emblematic of how difficult it may be to, in fact, square this circle. Because if you look at the abundance movement, you would say, hey, great, they want to get rid of stupid regulations and permitting procedures, and they want to enable us to build stuff, and they want energy infrastructure to be built out. Fantastic, right? But if you kind of scratch their take a little bit, and you look beneath the surface, I mean, what the vision they have in mind seems to be like a socially liberal ecotopia where everything's run off wind or solar. They hate fossil fuels. They do think there's an impending climate catastrophe, which we don't press the accelerator on getting rid of dirty energy and implementing clean energy, then certainly like half the United States will be flooded. And, I mean, they've got this thing in their heads. I mean, and these are very reasonable people. They're smart. I like them. But nevertheless, that they have drunk the Kool-Aid and they like it of we're on the verge of this climate catastrophe. And, there's a certain logic to that. If you believe that, if that's your starting point, then what abundance is good for is doing that. That's why it's so important. Well, housing secondarily, but and the Latino man who wants his big ass truck, screw him. I mean, we've got to like move as fast as possible to do this. And I think that as politics, I think that's a really bad idea. Plus, I think the sort of the underlying assumption about impending climate catastrophe is highly debatable.
Well, there's two threads I'd like to pull on there. One is in your conversation with Derek, when you did press him on natural gas, and he essentially said, like, these are about my values. And I thought it was really interesting that instead of making a case for why you didn't need natural gas because solar and wind could meet the needs, there was there was a sort of a like, I can be anti-natural gas because it is my values, which takes us back to this religious like framing. Exactly. And I don't know what to do with that except to understand it and know that if there's going to be a solution to be had, we still have to make the case that actually the abundance agenda could never be built on wind and solar alone. It could possibly be built on SMRs once we get them going, in 10 or 20 or 30 years. But in the next 5 to 10 years, the abundance agenda is going to be built on largely on natural gas, natural gas, abated or not, depending on the environment. And so I think that's a pretty interesting, there's an important path there that I want to continue to find. Do you have any advice for our listeners, for industry listeners, on should they be engaging with the abundance movement? Should they be paying attention? What's the way not to be a part of this this sort of anti-climate overcorrection?
I think they should totally engage with it. And I think they should challenge the idea that if we pursue abundance and try to make the economy more dynamic and get rid of barriers in the way of energy production, it has to be, you can't have favoritism. You should just let the market decide, get stuff out of the way. If there's underdeveloped, sort of technologies that we need to invest in, we should do that. But that isn't wind and solar anymore. Wind and solar are mature technologies. I mean, advanced nuclear reactors, we need more work. Geothermal, we need more work. There's carbon capture and stuff, we need more work. So those things could afford to have some subsidies and obviously a lot of research. But wind and solar, to push it ahead as we are now with the subsidies they get and the procedures, that sort of we propose to make it hard to do. I mean, we just have to be consistent in what we're saying and what we're kind of how we're trying to liberate the economy, right? We can't just assume that we should because of our values, we should put our thumbs on the scale for my values, because your values may not be the voters' values. I mean, if you want this to be a broad movement, you have to have broad consensual goals, not instantiate the value set of coastal liberal elites about what's the right way to do things. And in Derek's defense, he did talk in my podcast about how, I get the thing about cost. We just can't be associated with a costly energy regime.
Yeah.
We probably are going to have natural gas for a while, even though I hate it. So that's an opening, right, of sorts.
It was
I
a
mean,
big,
it's
actually,
realistic.
I give you credit because I've probably listened to 15 of their podcasts, and that was the first time I ever heard that. So I think you were a part of the evolution. So well done.
Yeah, hopefully.
So we're talking as energy pragmatists, right? And part of the moment is a kind of forced energy pragmatism. You wrote something about the unstoppable rise of energy realism. So
Right.
here's the question I've been wondering: are we in
Mhm.
a post climate world? Like, is it possible that we're not going to have this huge polarization around climate, or it becomes a non-discussion topic? What's your thought about where climate will fit into the mix going forward?
That's a good question. I mean, I would say we're, as I was alluding to earlier, our pal Roger Pilkey was pointing out, we probably are in a period where peak climate catastrophism is past, and there'll be a period of time where this issue fades somewhat from public view. Would it therefore be fair to say we're in a post-climate era? I don't know about that. Let's say maybe we're in a post-climate catastrophist era,
That's interesting. Yeah.
where I
Mm-hmm.
think that view is going to be increasingly less common and less drive policy, and less likely to drive policy. I mean, look what's happening in the UK and all these other countries that have sort of pursued these policies so vigorously. It's just not working. And I think, the combination of all these, events that have taken place as this so-called transition has continued is just pushing people inevitably in the direction of being much more pragmatic and realistic about the energy mix and away from, a sort of almost millennial, post-apocalyptic sort of
Mm-hmm.
commitment to
Mm-hmm.
zeroing out fossil fuels as fast as possible. I mean, it ain't practical and it ain't going to happen.
I hope that you're right, because I do love this idea of being in a post climate catastrophism world. Now that said, I've gotten to sit at around these tables of center lefties all trying to figure out what happens post, the November 2024 election, and what are we going to do and how are we going to position. And the theme continues to be, particularly among ENGOs and climate activists, is we didn't do a enough job telling our story. And by that, they mean we didn't do a good enough job of explaining the climate apocalypse. And
Right.
I mean, that's a little like, that's still out there. It's like, well, we'll just have to do it better.
Yeah.
We'll have to be scarier. And so I do wonder, do you see any signs that Democrats are meaningfully moving to the middle? I think of it as there's like the rebellion, and then there's maybe the alternative. Is the alternative getting traction? Some kind of center lefty path that will be focused on climate pragmatism?
Well, that's another good question. Yeah, I think it's the case that the climate NGO industrial complex is still pretty committed to catastrophism, and there's a good reason for that. That's what they're selling. That's where they get their money from. Always follow the money. I mean, a ton of money has been sort of piped into these organizations, predicated on the idea that we must stop the climate apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
And so how likely is it that they and the staffers who inhabit these organizations are suddenly going to become pragmatists? I'd say it's pretty small. I think it's much more important and much more likely that if there's a break, it will come from politicians who have to respond to voters, and voters who in fact do not want what the climate NGO industrial complex wants. That is another potential vector by which things might change. I mean, Bill Gates famously recently ratcheted down, if not completely eliminated, some of the climate work that one of his many foundations is doing, or areas. I guess it's breakthrough energy. Anyway, it's hard to keep track of all this stuff. But anyway, he's clearly pulling back. But I think there's a ton of other gazillionaires out there who's still 100% committed to this, like Michael Bloomberg, of course, the Laurene Powell Jobs and people like that. I mean, they're all in. So I don't expect it to go away anytime soon, but I think we should have more faith in the idea that politicians want to respond to the marketplace of voters who just aren't interested in this stuff and want other things. They want cheap, reliable, and abundant energy. They want economic growth. They're just not that committed to the goals of the climate movement. But so far, we don't see a lot of Democratic politicians really breaking with this, right? Even in terms of what people have been saying recently since Trump came into office, or the campaign and then Trump came into office. I mean, you did have obviously people saying things like Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, fracking isn't so bad. We still get to have fracking. There's sort of been some gestures in that direction from other people, but who are the prominent Democratic politicians who are willing to flat out get out there and say, in fact, I do not think there's an impending climate catastrophe. And I think it's much more important we do A, B, C, and D in terms of energy policy, and we're still going to have fossil fuels around for a long time, and we must be realistic about all of this. Not very many, if any. And I think it's just become so right-coded to say this kind of stuff, which is so, I think, sensible and true to the actual science and the politics and the physics and the economics of the whole thing. I mean, it's right-coded. So if it's so right-coded to say stuff that's reasonably sensible and pragmatic on the Democratic side, it's just harder for politicians to break out of that prison and say different things, especially if they're worried about how they're going to appear to Democratic activists who obviously loom much larger in the Democratic Party than just your average rank and file voter in the country as a whole does. So Matt Yglesias said something interesting the other day when I was talking to him about this stuff. I don't know if you said it on your show. He said, what we really need is someone to be in New Hampshire, canvassing for the Democratic presidential nomination and say, geez, it's pretty hot here today, a lot hotter than it normally is. But you know what? That's not so bad. I mean, in other words, talk about how things might be a little bit different, but also say, we can handle this. It's not so bad. And I think that's really hard for Democrats trained in the school of climate alarmism to get in touch with, because their staffs, their kids, whatever, they all believe that every unusual weather event is symptomatic of this impending catastrophe. So it's a little hard for them to break out, and I think the voters are going to have to be the ones delivering the shock.
Yeah, you're helping me craft the recommendations of the book, which is essentially that we as the climate pragmatists or realists need to understand that the apocalypse, it's really scary to step away from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so they need cover, they need data, they need stories, and they need partners. And I think the only massive concern I have at this moment is that the pendulum just swings so far to being anti-climate action as a matter of principle versus sensible decarbonization, sensible risk mitigation, sensible, grow the energy system more innovative. But I do think there's room, at least for our audience, to participate by thinking about how hard this is for those, instead of okay, yeah, that climate stuff got a bit overwrought. Let's bring it down a notch. We do need to understand that among their constituencies, there's just one way to talk about it. And like you said, if you don't talk about it, you're part of the problem.
Right, exactly.
And help give them a path, partners, tools. That won't happen if we're a part of this overcorrection around climate.
Yeah. One way I put it, Tisha, is I think this is a key problem for Democrats in general who want a more pragmatic approach, and for the kind of people you're talking about who, all of us climate pragmatists. The real issue is, how do we provide the off-ramp among Democrats, sort of to get away from climate catastrophism? What's the off-ramp? What'll make them comfortable enough that they're willing to take that step? Because some people will just kind of see the light. They'll be smell-pilled or whatever, and they'll realize this is completely idiotic what I just believe. But that's not the way it's going to go down for most people. Then they're going to need that off-ramp so they can gradually get off the road to where they would go.
And we're not going to do it by wagging our finger at them, right? Or making it saying you can't put climate on your website. That's not how we're going to help provide.
That's not how it should go down.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great point. So, Ruy, last question I ask all my guests. In this complicated, scary, difficult world, what are you most optimistic about?
Well, I'm optimistic that at the end of the day, the fact that the voters get to decide will actually be a good thing, because I think that they still haven't found what they're looking for, either generally and in terms of energy policy. And they're going to keep on sending signals, if politicians are willing to hear them, that will eventually be received, and that there's still enormous potential in this country. Obviously, I don't think we're on the verge of apocalypse. I think we're on the verge of continued stagnation. But I think we can come out of that stagnation in ways that actually make the country a better and more dynamic place. It's just going to take some time. So, maybe that's not as optimistic as you'd like, but that's as optimistic as I get, that over time,
I'll take it.
Things will change.
I'll take
this
it.
Too shall pass.
Yeah, I'm a wild optimist, but I'm also an incrementalist. Like, I do believe that all incremental progress is progress. And the fact that we can have these conversations about pragmatic environmentalism, sure, pragmatic climate, I consider that a plus. So I'll take your optimism and I'll hold on to it. So,
and it's a lot easier to have this kind of conversation now, certainly on the left, than it would have been 3 or 4 years ago. So it's moving kind of
even 6 months ago. Yeah, it's a lot easier now. Yeah. Well, Ruy, thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Things podcast.
Sure, it was fun, and keep the faith.
That's our episode for today. Thanks so much to our listeners for your engagement, for the excuse you give me to have these fun conversations. And thank you, of course, to Ruy for joining me. I really found compelling this idea that we could take this momentum that's happening around in the democratic movement around abundance and use it to both evolve our thinking, but could we influence their thinking as well? I'd be really interested in that. Some of you may be wondering, what is all this abundance business that you're talking about? We will link to those books in our show notes, but in my upcoming solo podcast, I think I'll do a little primer on what's going on on the abundance movement and what you need to know about it. And I think the opportunities that it puts out for us. I'd like to get my thoughts around those things anyway. If you like what you're listening to, I hope you'll take a moment and give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcast. That helps others in the industry find us. If you'd like to know more about what we do at Adamantine, please go to energythinks.com. You can check out our work while you're there. I hope you will subscribe to my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. You can also find that on Substack. I'd like to thank my colleague, Kayla Chives, for making all things Energy Thinks possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.